ADAS model shows the relationship between price levels and real GDP. The price level is the price level in a national economy and is measured by a price index such as the GDP deflator or CPI. What the ADAS model will help us understand is the changes in the business cycle and how certain events can affect real GDP and inflation within an economy. So, like any other market model, we'll be dealing with demand and supply. In the ADAS model, this is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is our aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand, which represents the total demand on all final goods and services produced domestically within a given year. As you can see, it's downward sloping, meaning that as the price level decreases, real GDP increases, and vice versa. So why is this the case? There are three effects within an economy that determine this inverse relationship. If price level is decreasing, real wealth increases, leading to an increase in consumption. This increase in consumption leads to an increase in real GDP. Similarly, a decrease in price means that the demand for money decreases, leading to lower interest rates, which has two effects. Lower interest rates mean that consumption and investment will increase. It also means that the nominal interest rate decreases, leading to an increase in net exports, as domestic goods and services are now cheaper for foreign consumers. Both of these effects lead to an increase in real GDP. And so now, hopefully you can get a sense as to why the aggregate demand is downward sloping, showing the inverse relationship between price level and real GDP. Aggregate supply, which is shown in both the long run and the short run in the ADAS model. We'll start with the SRAS, the short run aggregate supply, which shows the relationship between price level and real GDP when price and wages are constant. So this is an assumption we're making. There are instances when this will not be assumed, and therefore the SRAS will be upward sloping. But for simplicity, we will assume that those factors are constant in the short run. So, assuming that prices and wages are constant, the SRAS will be horizontal, meaning that firms will supply any amount of output at a given price level. We also have a long-run aggregate supply curve, or an LRAS, which shows the relationship between price level and real GDP when price and wages are flexible. The LRAS is completely vertical. So when these three curves intersect, we have long-run equilibrium. And at this point, potential GDP is achieved. There are instances when we are in short-run equilibrium where only the SRAS and AD curves intersect. In these cases, there's an output gap, meaning that potential or full output is not achieved. So in this case, on the left, you can see we have a recessionary gap as actual output is less than the potential output. And on the right, we have an inflationary gap as the actual output is greater than the potential output. These output gaps are due to the shocks in aggregate demand or in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Demand shocks are events affecting autonomous expenditure or consumption. If there is an increase in consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, there's a positive shock and the aggregate demand curve will shift right. This leads to an increase in real GDP, a decrease in unemployment, and then an increase in price level. I'll explain this later. Conversely, if there's a decrease in those factors, consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, the AD curve will shift to the left, and unemployment will increase, and price level will decrease as a result of the decrease in real GDP. So let's take an example. Let's say that the government increases taxes, which in turn decreases consumption. So this will cause a negative aggregate demand shock, and the curve will shift to the left. At this point, real GDP decreases. And you can see this is our actual output here, or actual GDP. And this is our short-run equilibrium point. In the short run, there's a recessionary gap, as actual output is less than the potential long-run output. High unemployment will lead to a decrease in wages and production costs, meaning that firms will start to decrease their prices. And as the price level decreases, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift down, and GDP will return to the potential level. As you can see, we return back to our potential GDP. Supply shocks are caused by events affecting business costs. So this can be due to a shock event, but it can also be due to a change in price inputs, amongst other factors. So let's assume that input prices decrease due to a decrease in wages. This means that the SRAS curve will shift down and create an inflationary gap, as actual GDP is less than the potential GDP. So real GDP in the short run will increase, and unemployment will decrease, which leads to an increase in wages and other production costs in the long run. And so the SRAS curve will shift back upwards to SRAS 1 in the long run, and the GDP will return back to its potential output.